Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCS week number 3 overview, analysis, and of course at the end, my updated power rankings. LCS is flying. It is moving fast. We are getting into kind of the back half of this split already. This is going to be the final week of the first round robin, which is actually insane. It's crazy just how quick this season is going. Again, with the lockout, they had to condense so much into such a little amount of time, so only 6 weeks in the regular season, and we get to cover week 3 here. So a lot of information already being told to us by the end of this week. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. What teams are overperforming or underperforming your expectations, or maybe overperforming or underperforming the records that they currently have. Would love to know you guys' thoughts and feedback down below. Of course, in this video, what we're going to be doing is going over all 15 games across all 3 days, talking about a player of the game, a dud of the game, the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate in that individual game, and then, of course, at the end of the week, I will be giving you my updated power rankings after the end of week number 3, as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week for the entirety of week 3 as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. We've got a lot to cover in this video, and we get to kick it off with day number 1. And day 1 was kicked off with a matchup between TSM and Evil Geniuses that Evil Geniuses is going to be able to take. Really good for them. They moved to 6-1 at the start of this split. You know, I was pretty high on this team. I thought that they were going to be a lot better than people said they were. Revenge is a good player. I was really high on the bot lane of Unforgiven and Ayla, but even I couldn't have predicted a complete turnaround like this team has been able to do. They are legitimately one of the best teams in the entire region, full stop. Really not even all that comparable at the current moment, and they're really, 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 really fun to watch. They're just really cohesive. I think they work really well as a unit. They're very good together as a group. It's not necessarily 1 or 2 players stepping up and then everybody else just kind of being along for the ride. Really, everyone on this team is playing well, and I think that's why it's been such a good thing for them. There were a couple of players on this team that I think really, lost their minds in a good way in this game. Player of the game for me is going to go to Unforgiven. In the bot lane, his damage on the Varus was massive. He was up, ridiculous amount of CS, as was everybody on this Evil Geniuses team. We'll get to that. Every single lane won, which basically made it impossible for this Nocturne to have any sort of impact on the game overall, but Unforgiven was a big part of that. Not only was he strong in the early game, though, it felt like he had the most amount of impact on ending the game and actively being the damage threat towards the back half, and so for me, he's going to get player of the game, although I think realistically, Ayla also had a great game, and then it'd be hard-pressed not to talk about Revenge in the top lane on this Renekton, who just obliterated Haunter. We'll get to that in just a little bit, but Unforgiven for me was probably the most consistent performer throughout the game, but like I said, it really was a team effort. There wasn't an individual player that I felt was significantly better than everybody else on the team. JoJo had a really good game on the Yone, was definitely destroying Ruby in the mid lane, even though TSM was pumping a ridiculous amount of resources into trying to shut down that Yone. And then Armeo honestly just didn't really have to do all that much on this Sejuani. All of his lanes were winning, and it's really easy to play an enabler or an initiator or something like a Sejuani when you have 3 winning lanes. It's a lot easier to be in that situation. So overall, Evil Genius is looking relatively good. Revenge absolutely obliterated Haunter. Really close to giving him player of the game here, but I just think that Unforgiven was a little bit more consistent throughout the whole game, but I'm talking 5 plates and 25 CS for Revenge with him proxying waves. It was actually ridiculous. He's been playing super well to start this split, but Evil Geniuses just look super cohesive. They look super good right now, and I think they played well. And then for TSM, substitution coming in. Ruby is officially here in North America. He's replacing Insanity. I've said many, many times on this channel that I think Insanity is probably the better player at the current moment, but they're going to give Ruby a shot because they brought him all the way over from Europe and from Korea originally, so they're definitely going to give him at least some time here. And in game 1, they wanted to invest a lot of resources in him. They really wanted to try to make sure that he could get comfortable. They put him on his, biggest comfort pick, I would say, in the Azir, maybe outside of the Cassiopeia. Those are the 2 that I most associate with Ruby. And then they invested a lot of resources into trying to get him ahead in the mid lane. Unfortunately, Ruby just lost in the 1v1, and so there really wasn't a lot he could get done. But that wasn't specific to Ruby. Everybody on this team lost in the early game. It was a disaster for them. Wild Turtle and Chime got run over in this laning phase from a long-range Varus with Amelia, which is almost impossible for the Kai'Sa to deal with. And then Haunter got absolutely brutalized on the top side of this map. He's going to get done of the game. And honestly, I was kind of hyping up Haunter. I thought he was relatively okay, very up and down over the beginning couple weeks, but it's starting to get to the point where I'm out on him as a top laner. He's just not been very consistent at this level. He's certainly lost pretty heavily to some of the better top laners in the league, and that's going to start being concerning. This team really has relied on Insanity and Wild Turtle in particular to be able to win games over the beginning part of this split, and they've been able to do it relatively well, but Hanser, I think, definitely needs to step up if this team wants to get even remotely where I have them ranked in my power rankings at the end of last week. He was miserable. Like I said, down like 5 plates, like 25 CS, was getting proxied. The Cassante was doing nothing. It was just not a very good game for Hanser, and he's had a couple of these over the beginning part of the split, but really, there wasn't a player on TSM that was kind of the redeeming factor. Boogie tried his best in the jungle, but like I said, when you're playing Nocturne with 3 losing lanes, that's kind of a disaster. There's really not a lot that you're going to be able to do in a situation like that. So for TSM, hopefully they're going to be able to turn that around. They've shown interesting things over the beginning couple weeks, and that's why I had them ranked so high, because consistency in the LCS just doesn't exist right now, and TSM has at least won some games, but I think their talent level is finally starting to catch up with them. And then for Evil Geniuses, they look great. I mean, 6-1 definitely tells the story of how well this team has looked. This week is not particularly easy for them in terms of schedule, but so far they've played a lot of good competition already, and they've been able to come out on top. This is one of the top 2 or 3 at worst teams in the LCS at the current moment, and that's got to be really exciting for EG fans. And then moving on to our second game of day 1, and we finally get to break the curse. We had FlyQuest taking on Team Liquid, and FlyQuest does pick up their first win of the split here over a good Team Liquid team, or at least what we see as a good Team Liquid team. The questions are definitely starting to arise for this roster and for this team, but FlyQuest finally being able to pick up their first win. It wasn't the cleanest game in the entire world, but their draft definitely tipped them over the top. You have one team with 2 really big tanks and some backline damage dealers, you know, a pretty standard front-to-back team fight comp, and then you've got another team with no damage, except maybe the Ahri. Like, I mean, Ashe can do damage, obviously, but not a consistent amount of damage, especially not in this meta, and really not a lot of frontline either, and so you're really looking at a situation where FlyQuest is in a much easier position to be able to win the game the later this goes, and the game went 44 minutes, and so congratulations to FlyQuest. They did pick this up, and honestly, a lot of their players did look good towards the back half of the game. Still some very sloppy mistakes coming in from this team, but for the most part, being able to pick up the win is hopefully going to be enough to start boosting their confidence to the point where they can continue to win more games and kind of get back onto the trajectory that maybe we all hoped for. Player of the game for me is going to go to Prince. I think there are 2 players in particular on FlyQuest that you have to point out here. Prince was obviously fantastic towards the back half of this game. His positioning is near immaculate. He was never really in danger of being killed against a Renekton, an Ahri, a Vi. That's a pretty dangerous situation to be in for a Xayah and for an AD carry in general, and I think Prince played it well. But his damage was really good as well. It's not just the positioning, it's his damage. So the late game team fighting of Prince definitely sets him over the top, but you got to talk about impact in the top lane on this Poppy, who was genuinely unkillable. The low damage comp of Team Liquid really opens up the door for something like Poppy to be a huge nuisance for TL to actually deal with, and man, they really had no actual answer to him in this game. So Impact, Prince, both playing really well. Were some concerns. Vikla in particular is still getting caught out in side lanes. It feels like he is very mental boomed. Like, even in this game where FlyQuest was able to win, it definitely feels like Vikla is just not there. I don't know what's going on. This is not how he played last split. I still think he can get back to the form that he was at, and there were a couple of team fights towards the back half of this game where he was really good on the Tristana, but there are just some mistakes sprinkled in here and there that are just not signs that I want to feel very good about when it comes to Vikla, I guess. And so Spica, Vulcan, they were good as well. Spica in particular was able to set up quite a few things. Vulcan was creating a lot of action, but he was sacrificing his life in most of these team fights for it. That's your job as Rakan, though. Certainly not going to be upset by that. But Prince and Impact were definitely the standout members, in my opinion, from FlyQuest. And then for Liquid on the other side, dud of the game is going to go to Pioshik in the jungle. Really just felt like he had to pick almost anything else here besides the Vi. I understand that it's a champion that, you know, he has played quite a lot of over the past year, but you need damage. If you're going to go with something like Ashe Milio in the bot lane, which I don't hate in isolation, I really like the idea of Ashe Milio. We've been seeing Ashe pick up priority, specifically here in North America, but also in a lot of other regions as well. Ashe is just decent right now for being able to set up the rest of your map and being able to try and play make from that AD carry position, but you need a high damage jungler, and you just didn't have that this game, and Pioshik also played significantly less aggressive than I think he needed to. This very much felt like the bad version of Pioshik that we got in spring, and not the better version that I think we've been getting in summer so far. Summit also had a significantly worse game. This Renekton was really not all that good. Summit and Pioshik were easily the 2 most forgettable, I would say, members members or worst members of Team Liquid in this one, and I think that's the most concerning part, right, is we always go back to the same story with Team Liquid. They are the most predictable team in the entire world, because if someone in Pyosik play well, they're going to win, and if someone in Pyosik don't play well, they're going to lose. It's just kind of how it is. I like Jan, and I like Core, and I think Jan is going to get overhated for this performance. It's not his fault that his champion isn't exactly going to be able to keep up in damage against Xayah. They probably just shouldn't have picked Ashe if they wanted to go with Vi, right? That really is just kind of how it goes, and I think Harry actually had a relatively good game on the Ahri, was really trying to get Vikla in those side lanes, and honestly, for the most part, was pretty successful on it. They have a lot of good pick potential on the side of TL, but there really just wasn't enough from the top side to be able to kind of stay competitive in this game, and I think it definitely showed. Liquid definitely still has their problems. They're dropping all the way to 4-3. They're actually only one game above 500 now after that undefeated start in week number 1, and so it really does feel like a lot of that form that they ended up having was just a little bit too good to be true, and this team is still going to be very similar. However, I do think that the middle part of the LCS is significantly more contentious than it was last split, so TL could still be in a position where they can kind of take some games, especially off the bad teams, but it's really going to be up to their top side. And then congratulations to FlyQuest for being able to pick up their first win. It was still pretty sloppy and definitely needed to be a little bit better, but the remnants of what we wanted FlyQuest to be are definitely there. Prince played really well. Impact played really well. Vulcan and Spica did their job. Vikla was good in team fights. He just made some mistakes throughout the game. There are definitely the makings of a very good team here for FlyQuest. They're just going to need to be able to copy, what they were able to do here and clean it up for the rest of the year. Then moving on to our third matchup here of day number 1, and it was a good one between Energy and Golden Guardians, and Energy is able to pick up the win. Really, really big win for them here. They had really been on kind of a free-fall slide, I would say, at the beginning of this split. Certainly didn't look nearly as good as I think a lot of people really wanted to see them be, and they went for a little bit more of a standard comp here, something that they're really not necessarily known for, which is more of a play for an AD carry kind of late-game style of comp, and Energy really, CLG really didn't do all that last split. So really interesting to see them go towards it here. Golden Guardians as well, though, performing well up until some pretty critical endgame mistakes coming in from them. As you notice, this game was 50 minutes, a crazy game coming in from both teams, and, both not necessarily closing out nearly as, I would say, cleanly as maybe you would want, but still, Energy being able to capitalize on the mistakes of Golden Guardians maybe a little bit better than you would expect maybe some of the other teams. So good stuff from them. Player of the game is going to go to Contracts in the jungle for me on this Ivern. Really, really fun game from the Ivern here. Obviously, this is a pick that we've been seeing rise in popularity quite a bit globally. Talked about it a ton in my LPL video yesterday, and so there's definitely some interesting things to talk about when it comes to this champion, but Contracts piloted it in such a very interesting way. He played so aggro on this champion. Obviously, Contracts is a very aggressive player. He's been known to maybe risk the game on some very aggressive fights and skirmishes in the past, but in this one, he wasn't necessarily putting himself in danger, was just playing more like a damage dealer and less like a support coming out of the jungle position. He still built a lot of the traditional support items, but Cosmic Drive is certainly an interesting build on the Ivern. I actually really like what he was able to do this game, and I think he definitely helped out his team quite a bit, especially towards the back half. He was the most impactful player in the game by a long shot, in my opinion, and it definitely showed, but everybody held up their end of the bargain here. I think Palafox did a really good job of not really putting himself in danger, and in my opinion, he was the better mid laner in this game. FBI and Ignar actually did a really good job of being able to deal damage and set up fights towards the back half of the game. The Ivern's great and all, but you're going to need a hyper carrier or something to be able to deal that damage that Ivern doesn't necessarily make up for really at all, and the Kai'Sa definitely needed to be that in a lot of fights for Energy, and I think FBI definitely fulfilled his role. This was one of his better games on Energy up until this point, and really he's not clicked super well, I would say, with the rest of the players on this team, but I think it's getting better, and I still think he's plenty talented to be able to turn it around. And Ignar was fine on the rel. I know a lot of people dislike Ignar. I'm not particularly high on him myself, but he was more than fine on the rel. It felt like everybody on Energy definitely held up their end of the bargain, but it really was the Ivern that I think was standing out the most in terms of spotlight and attention. And then for Golden Guardians on the other side, you just had a couple of interesting kind of decisions towards the back half of the game that really ended up costing you. You look at the scoreline and you're like, how did this game go 50 minutes? Wasn't even particularly close. It was a particularly close game. Golden Guardians was actually in a really good position to maybe be able to end here, but they made an insane call to go go for Elder Dragon, or at least for River to try and sneak Elder Dragon while the rest of the team just, I guess, protected and tried to keep energy off of it, which is an insane call. But clearly Gory did not get the message. He was not trying to do that. He was just not in the same position as the rest of his team. It was very, very weird. He ends up being out of position. The rest of the team doesn't have the damage to actually be able to fight energy, especially without the Maokai engage. So they just end up losing. They try to do everything all at once, and it's a disaster. They end up losing everything because of it and losing the game because of it. It's a mistake that obviously I expect them to be able to clean up, but it's the kind of mistake that you also expect from Golden Guardians because they are a very aggressive team that is going to try to get everything on the map. It really was like we're either going to win the game or lose the game off of this play, so pretty crazy. But I think individually, micro-wise, there were a couple of good things to point out. Stixxay, I think, actually had a really good game micro-wise, especially mechanic-wise. He's really, really in form right now. He's still really good on the Nautilus. I thought he was relatively fine this game. But topside was a little bit concerning. My dud of the game is going to go to Licorice. I don't love giving it to him because I do think he applied quite a bit of pressure in side lanes, but when you have a 50-minute game, oftentimes there really isn't one player that just had a terrible game just straight up, and I think Licorice was a little bit lackluster in the team fights, and so he's going to get my dud of the game. But Gory for making that crucial error towards the back half of the game, River for, just trying to sneak Elder in the first place. Like, there were just so many weird plays that ended up happening for Golden Guardians from their top side that, I think you could realistically give dud of the game to any of them. I'm going to give it to Licorice because I felt like his impact in the team fights was significantly less than any of the other members. But again, Gory, River, Licorice, give it to any of those. I don't think you can give it to Stixxay and Huhi. They were really good this game, but Golden Guardians definitely showing some cracks in the armor. Again, they're also going to fall to 4-3, although this one I think is much more defensible than what happened to Team Liquid. I think Golden Guardians was in this game even in a position where they were playing from behind for a lot of it, and they did their best to stay alive. A couple of mistakes towards the back half end up in a loss, but I still think this GG team is pretty good, and I don't want to overreact to kind of a crazy ending here. But for Energy, it's hopefully going to get them some confidence to be able to take down a team like Golden Guardians. Energy really has not been able to figure out their groove so far this split, and this is a really nice win to have on their resume. And then moving on to our fourth game here of day number 1, and it was a matchup between 100 Thieves and Dignitas that 100 Thieves is going to be able to take. It does feel at least a little bit like this team is getting back on track. They had such a rough start to the split. It really looked like a lot of their players were just underperforming, a couple in particular that I pointed out in previous videos, but it does feel like maybe getting Quid in, getting him a little bit more adjusted to not only, playing with a lot of these teammates, but living here in North America, living in California is helping out this team quite a bit. They already look so much more cohesive and so much more like a unit and a team than they did at really any point last week, and I think that's really the big positive takeaway from this. I think you can talk about a couple of individual players that are still playing well, most notably in the side lanes that I think really stood out to me, but I think the improvement in general in terms of the communication and the team-oriented plays that they were able to make both in the early and in the mid-game in particular, that's definitely going to be the game-changing improvement for 100 Thieves. If they can continue to be a team that makes those plays and is able to do those relatively well, the team fighting's going to come. We know they're talented. We know that they can mechanically perform towards the back half of the game. And so let's talk about it. Player of the game for me, a little bit up in the air again, kind of like a lot of the other games that we've talked about today so far, but I'm going to go with Someday in the top lane. Really, really good to see Someday perform well again here on 100 Thieves. Not that he was bad on Evil Geniuses. I think he was relatively underrated in terms of what he was doing last split on EG, but, 100 Thieves Someday just hits a little bit different in terms of what he's actually able to do. He destroyed Rich in and out of lane in this game, which is really impressive. Rich has been probably the biggest bright spot for Dignitas over the beginning part of the split, and really, Rich was just not on the same level as Someday in this one. I know Casante's a really strong pick, but we've seen multiple Casantes today already get absolutely destroyed, get proxy farmed by a Renekton, and so for Someday to be able to step up and be as good as he was in this game is definitely very noticeable. Double Lift also, obviously, I think getting broadcast player of the game for almost getting a Penta in the final team fight. Scumbag Quid hitting the Nexus so that he can't actually get the Penta, but Double Lift continues to play well. I still think he's a more than solid ADC at this level, someone who is going to continue to be really consistent. I think that's really been the thing with Double Lift, especially if you give him resources. He's going to consistently be good, and I think that there really aren't a lot of players in the league that are going to give you a similar output. AD carry is a really strong position in the LCS in terms of depth, but I think Double Lift offers something that a lot of them don't, which is game-to-game consistency and the knowledge of basically what exactly you're going to get if you do give them resources. And then you've got Quid definitely stepping up, a much better game from him here. Really team fought well on the Azir. Busio with some good engages on the Nautilus. Nautilus. Closer was fine. Not very aggressive in the early game, but this team didn't necessarily need that from him. They just needed him to not be a problem and to be an initiator in the back half for double lift, and he definitely was that. So everybody on 100 Thieves kind of fulfilling their role, I would say, in this one. And then for Dignitas on the other side of the map, just a couple of the mistakes that I was most worried about kind of coming to fruition. I really was not high on this team even after they started 3-3. I thought a lot of their weaknesses were going to continue to get exposed, and it did feel like that in game number 1 at the very least here. A couple of their players just weren't able to step up. Rich had a much poorer game than he had in week number 2, where he was really good for this team, and it really does feel like if Rich doesn't step up, there are a lot of problems in terms of Dignitas team fighting in the back half of the game. Jensen has really not been all that good this split so far, and that's definitely an area where I think he's going to need to improve. The Jace was not the pick from him. I really don't like champions that need aggressive play for Jensen. I think it just isn't something that he has been very comfortable on at the LCS level, at least in the past 2 years, and so I would very much like to see him go back to the things that worked last week when this team was winning, like the Orianna, you know, like the Zillion on Cloud9, like the Anivia on Cloud9, things like that I think definitely more stood out in terms of his playstyle. The Jace just didn't feel like it was it in this one, and then dead of the game for me is going to go to Diamond in the support position. He's had a really, really rough start to this split. He's been one of, if not the worst support in the league to start this split, which is so frustrating because Diamond was so good in the NACL. He's been so good in Academy for a long time, but it really does feel like he's kind of another one of those 4A players, if you will, where he's too good for Academy, too good for the NACL, going to be one of the best players, if not the best, in his role at that level, but just seems to have some sort of stage fright when it comes to playing on the LCS stage, and it's unfortunate because I like him a lot as a player, but it's just not been a great start to the split for him. Tomo's been fine. I think his scoreline is a little bit better than maybe how he performed, but he's a very aggressive player, someone who can generate leads if he's given the opportunity. It's just not really been a bot-focused team for Dignitas. They've wanted to play towards topside, and Rich lost, and that's always going to be a little bit unfortunate. I think Dignitas can still be competitive, but there's a reason I didn't have a lot of faith in this team coming out of week number 2, even when they were 500, and that's because I do think the talent on this team is still pretty concerning to me. And then for 100 Thieves, hopefully they're getting back into form here. This absolutely should be a top, 4 or top 5 team at the very worst in the league with a lot of the way that the competition is going right now, and I think they're getting closer to that point. I'm not necessarily sure they're there at the moment, but by the end of the week, if they continue to play like this, they definitely could be. And then moving on to our 5th and final game of day number 1 here, and it was a little bit of a blowout as we saw Cloud9 taking on Immortals, probably the best team versus the worst team, and Cloud9 definitely getting the job done in pretty dominant fashion. This was not a close game. It was way less close than even the scoreline would tell you. The 6 kills from the side of Immortals were basically handed over to them by Cloud9. A couple of really, really bad plays towards the back half for C9 that were pretty funny, but not necessarily the most indicative of how close this game ended up being. C9 was so far ahead. This was an absolute slaughter from them, and you got to give them a lot of credit. The first thing that you got to point out, and first and foremost for them, in terms of the positives, is the bot lane, and it continues to be the bot lane. Berserker is the best player in North America. It's not up for debate anymore. He is absolutely dominant, and I think Broadcast gave him player of the game. He absolutely deserves it. He's well on his way to another MVP season here in summer, which is insane, but for me, I'm going to go ahead and give player of the game to Sven on this rel. I've been lower on Sven in terms of what he's been able to offer individually as a support. I thought he would look worse on a team that didn't necessarily have the same kind of communication and consistent early game leads that C9 was able to generate. However, it feels like Sven every single split has just gotten better and better and better and better, which obviously is going to be the case when you role swap to a new position, but it is really good to see. It feels like Sven is very much transformed, mechanically speaking, into one of the best supports in the entire region, and that's huge for this team because really at the end of the day, mechanically speaking, Sven was really the only player I was worried about in his role when it comes to, like, international competition or whatever. But I don't even think you can say that anymore. I really feel confident that C9 has a top 1, 2, or 3 player in every single role in the league, and that's massive. That is absolutely huge. Sven looking really good on rel, has grown his champion pool considerably. I know it was kind of a meme that, oh, Sven can't play engagers. It's just not the case anymore. It used to just be Alistair. Now he's kind of expanded it, I think, into a lot of different champions. Rel definitely being one of them. He had a great game here. And I think a lot of the plays that Berserker ended up making were because of Sven's great initiation. So credit there, but Berserker was still really good. Like, I'm not trying to take away from what Berserker offered. I'm just saying Sven deserves the credit as well. Blabber was fantastic on the Vi, able to generate like legit like a 10 camp lead at 20 minutes into this game, which is absurd for a Vi going into a Viego, especially when the Vi was significantly more active in the early game. So really good stuff from Blabber. He ends up only dying once this game, and it was because Berserker baited him into dying for no reason, which is really funny. And you know, you can get away with that when you're super far ahead, but shout out Berserker for killing Blabber for no reason. Fudge continues to have a lot of haters online, and I still think he's the best top laner in North America. And then Eminus is more than solid, even on the facilitators. That was always going to be the question with him, was can he play the facilitators as well as he can play the mid lane carries, especially the lane dominant carries, and that's definitely been the case. And so very happy to see that Cloud9 looks complete. They continue to look like the best team in the league. I feel like I'm getting super repetitive with their analysis. And then for Immortals, I just don't have a lot of faith in them. They looked pretty good in week number 1, and it feels like they have completely fallen off a cliff here in the last 2 weeks of the split. Kenvi is going to get my dead of the game again here on the Viego. I'm pretty much ready to give up on the Kenvi experiment, at least on Immortals. I think maybe he could turn into a good player on a better organization. We know what Kenvi could do at the NACL level. We knew that he was a super hyped prospect that a lot of people saw as a potential all-pro player at the LCS level, but it just has never looked good for an extended period of time at the LCS level. I think you can make a really big argument that Spring was his best split ever, and that's really not a great argument to be made because Immortals was really bad in Spring. And so for Kenvi, I think at this point, this team, this construction of players, this organization, it's just not going to work for him. He was super far behind this game. The Viego was completely useless. Down camps, down in pressure, just had absolutely nothing going for him, and that was a big disaster for this team in this game. The bot lane was also really bad. Tactical and Treats continue to be kind of an up and down, positive and negative kind of bot lane tactical. I think can be fine, and it definitely feels like he's gotten a lot of his mental back, but, you know, when he loses early, he definitely does not have a good mid game, and that continued in this split. And then Treats has honestly been very disappointing the last 2 weeks. It feels like he's been one of the weaker supports in the league ever since week number 1, where he was actually really good. So interesting to see if he's going to be able to bounce back. Solo was fine on the Cassante. Balulu was fine on the Ahri. The solo laners were definitely not the problem. To me, it was jungle and it was bot lane that basically gave the game away at 5 minutes, and Cloud9 never looked back. So Immortals continuing to show that maybe I was right for putting them at number 10, and Cloud9 definitely showing that I was right to keep them at number 1. Moving on to day number 2 now, and we get to kick off day number 2 with a matchup between NRG and FlyQuest, and FlyQuest is able to pick up their second win of the split with another kind of shocking win here, a position that they probably shouldn't be in after the way that this game ended up going, but NRG just ends up throwing it away towards the back half. A couple of, again, very big mistakes coming in from a team that is playing against FlyQuest. We saw that at the beginning of the week on day number 1. We saw NRG benefit from that against Golden Guardians on day number 1, and so some crazy stuff going down in terms of the LCS and, you know, kind of trading wins back and forth, but FlyQuest coming out on top and doing a lot of things right in this game. There were a lot of things that were wrong. They could have been significantly more proactive in the early game, but at the end of the day, they still had to win the team fights towards the back half, and they did that. They were the better team in terms of team fighting, and that's why they won the game. My player of the game is going to go to Spica for that exact reason. The Sejuani setting up everything else that this team wanted to do was probably the reason that they ended up winning the game. I think you could realistically give this to Vikla as well. Some really good Tristana play. This was a significantly cleaner game, in my opinion, than what he showed on day number 1, where he was pretty consistently caught out in side lanes against Liquid. It felt a lot more cohesive. It felt like he was kind of the main damage dealer for what this team wanted to do. Prince and Vulcan were still fine. Not really any sort of problems coming in from them. Impact was a little bit overextended at times, but for the most part was just doing his job as Renekton and ended up getting targeted for it. Just overall, I think Fly did what they were supposed to do, but Spica, I think on this edge, was definitely the standout member, the player that I think we were most looking at in this game, and that is a good sign. Spica playing well is one of the better junglers in the league, and it's really good to hopefully see him get back onto the same page as the rest of this team. Him and Vikla together were very quietly very good as a unit last split, and I think getting them back on the same page, especially when it comes to the team fighting in the mid game, in terms of like where this team wants to go, I think is probably priority number 1 for FlyQuest. Yes, Prince and Vulcan getting on the same page would be absolutely massive, and then being able to dominate in the 2v2, especially with assistance, would be very big, but if you can get this jungle mid duo to be more of a positive, I think that's really what is going to change the fortunes for FlyQuest for the most part. But them just picking up their second win in general, I think is a positive, even if there were, you know, a couple of macro mistakes and a couple of micro mistakes in the game for them. They're certainly not fixed, and they're certainly not perfect, but they're getting closer and closer every game, I would say. And then for Energy on the other side, just a couple of major issues in this game that ended up, you know, costing them. Dud of the game, I think, could go to quite a few people. I'm going to give it to Dokla on this Jace because he was just significantly too aggressive towards the back half of the game, and he wasn't really followed up by the rest of his team. I do think that there were a couple of players who did play well, and I think that, you know, Contracts in particular, I think, is having a very good week and has definitely been the best player for Energy, but, you know, Dokla kind of running it down towards the back half was certainly not helping. And then I think reasonably a lot of people are criticizing FBI on this team. Ends up building the AP Varus, which is fine in this, you know, circumstance, but you have to hit your ultimate if you're going to play AP Varus, and he wasn't really playing like it was AP Varus. He was playing like it was Lethality Varus, and that's going to cause a little bit of a problem. It really didn't feel like he was all that practiced on the pick, or maybe the practice wasn't going necessarily well, because it just didn't feel like he knew how to play this particular build of this champion. That's fine. Sometimes you're not going to have great games, but this was a pretty bad time to have a bad game. And honestly, the bigger overarching problem for Energy was the macro. Again, this was something we talked about in their first game, but it was them having, I don't want to say better macro, but capitalizing on bad macro from Golden Guardians, and this time they're giving it back to FlyQuest, and you just got to be frustrated. It feels like a lot of these teams have regressed so much since Spring Split, and that's really not what you want to see. This team had significantly more cohesion and significantly better macro last split. Luger and Poom are out, FBI and Ignar are in, and now it just feels like they're super uncoordinated. They're all over the place, especially towards the back half of the game, and I'm really not sure what the fix for that is. They're individually very talented, and I think Contracts is playing really well this split, but I just don't really think that right now they're a unit. They're not a complete team, and they're going to continue to drop games if they continue to make the major mistakes that they've made throughout the first couple of weeks. And then for FlyQuest, again, it's a nice confidence builder. It's nice to get that second win on the season, but there still are a lot of things that this team needs to fix. I'm certainly not going to throw out the first couple of weeks just because they picked up a couple of kind of scrappy wins against teams that really didn't want to win to start week number 3. If they can continue to grow, and if these, you know, wins kind of turn into something, maybe a win streak for them where they do start to get better game by game, I'm going to start believing in this team again. There's a reason I didn't drop them into the bottom 2 or anything like that after they started 0-6, but it's not exactly something that's guaranteed with how they've played up until this point. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 2, and this was the one I think a lot of people were looking forward to. We had Team Liquid taking on Cloud9. And maybe surprisingly, Team Liquid able to walk away with a win in this one. Really didn't see this kind of being the situation for TL. I didn't expect them to be able to come in and beat Cloud9, but they looked really good in this game. They went back to a style that I think they perform significantly better on, which is, you know, a hyper carry or something that can deal damage in the bot lane, and then facilitators throughout the rest of the map. And, you know, you can also kind of flip that. I think if you wanted facilitators, you can have them in the bot lane, but you need Summon and Pioshik to be on something they can win the game on. And in this one, they wanted to play more for that bot lane, and you know what? They were able to dominate the early game. A couple of major errors coming in from Cloud9 that ended up losing them the game very quickly, and TL never really let go of that. I think that there was a real understanding and, you know, argument to be made that Cloud9 felt not too bad after the early game, if only because they know that Team Liquid is one of those teams that can throw the games towards the back half. They're a very bad team in the late game, or at least they have been over the course of this year so far. That's their big weakness, but good for TL for being able to, you know, take the gigantic lead that Cloud9 gave them and close out the game relatively cleanly. They looked good in this one. Player of the game was up for debate, a couple of really nice performances. I'm going to give it to Core JJ in the support position on this Renata. Really fun stuff coming out from Core. He basically won the lane at level 1 by absolutely destroying Sven, and from that point onwards, Berserker Sven, they weren't going to have any sort of pressure in this game, and it only got worse as things went on. Core's really good at Renata. This is a champion that he's been able to play all year long, and even in the spring where I think a lot of people were low on TL, me included as a team, I was much higher on Yon and Core, I think in particular, especially in the 2v2 in lane where it really felt like they were doing good job. And Core, I think a big reason for that is just his aggressiveness has not wavered. It's not waned at all. He can still be the player that moves around the map and wants to play with his jungle and wants to impact a lot of the other lanes, but he is still really good in the 2v2 even if it's not his specialty, and he continued to show that here. So Core's going going to get my player of the game. And then Jan was also phenomenal on this Aphelios. Really good to see him continue to step up. He's making a really solid argument to be like near the top of the Rookie of the Year standings. Obviously, someone like Eminus is definitely in that conversation on the other side of the map, but Jan has been really, really good for Team Liquid, and I think it's really, really fun to see him continue to grow into a player that I think a lot of people would like to have on their roster as an AD carry. Incredibly consistent, really good in lane, but can also team fight, and is just kind of an overall good player. Maybe not a superstar at that position, although I do think he could turn into one, but certainly more than capable as a starter for a team that wants to make worlds, in my opinion, out of this region. And it's not like the rest of this team is composed of slouches, right? You've got Summon and Pioshik on the top side. Pioshik had a good game here on the Wukong, a lot of really good engages, was definitely better than Blabber in this one, which we'll get to. And then Summit played his role well. I know he doesn't necessarily come across as like a tank player, but he can be relatively stable on the top side if you do want him to be weak side. He's just a little bit wild sometimes, and so when you need that frontline engage, if you need him to be a little bit more consistent towards the back half of the game, sometimes that can be a little bit of a problem. But Harry's fine in the mid lane. I don't think he's a superstar, but he's certainly good enough to win with, and this bot lane is really starting to step up. I think this could be a big turning point for Team Liquid. Hopefully, the stabilization of this bot lane can allow them to have a win condition other than Summon and Pioshik playing well. But then Cloud9 on the other side, unfortunate to get their second loss of the split, but honestly, they just got completely destroyed in the early game, and they were never able to recover. They flipped the game on a bunch of crazy plays that they really just did not need to make. Dud of the game is going to go to Sven, although realistically you could give this to Blabber in the jungle as well, and both were very, very not good in this game. Sven on the Rakan has been a little bit of a meme. Blabber on the Vi has been a little bit of a meme, and so Cloud9 not necessarily picking champions that align with the things that have worked for them in the past, maybe trying some things out against a team that they thought they could beat, but it did not work out. Sven threw the lane away in the bot lane basically at level 1, and they were never able to recover. He also had some awful engages towards the back half of the game as well. Just a really bad game coming in from the Rakan. And then Blabber has like a legit like 18% win rate on Vi over the course of his career, which is actually astounding. It's just weird. When he plays this champion, it feels like he goes in either too early or too late. It doesn't feel like he has a great understanding of how to play the early game on Vi. Like, I'm the biggest Vi hater, I think, in the universe, right? Like, you can go watch a lot of the videos from this channel, especially last year in 2022, where I was very low on the champion. I talked about how if you don't get a lead early game on Vi, you're just not going to be super useful as a champion, and I agree. That champion is still in a very similar spot. If you don't get an early lead on Vi, you're not going to be all that useful, and, you know, Blabber did not get an early lead here, but I do think you can get an early lead on Vi, and there are a lot of positive things she does as well, and Blabber just doesn't seem to know how to pilot that in the mid to late game really at all, and so a lot of really bad engages where he just goes in, suicides on ultimate, and just the rest of the team has to figure it out, right? But there were some positives. I think Aminus pulling out the AP Zeri mid actually looked relatively good. There are significantly worse picks in the meta right now. We're going to be seeing a lot of marksmen attempted to be played in that mid lane role in an AP capacity because of Static Shiv. Zeri kind of in a position where she's, you know, able to be tried, and I think Eminus was definitely the best player on Cloud9. I don't know if something like that would work, though, in a situation where teams actually tried to prioritize it in terms of taking it down. Berserker was fine on the Xayah, but his lane was doomed by his support so early on that he had no recovery. And then Fudge has just been whatever this split, which I'm hoping he gets better because he was so good in Spring. For me, was arguably the best player on Cloud9 in Spring, but really has not been that over the course of summer so far. So hopefully Cloud9 can figure out some of their mistakes, because they really should be the best team in the league, and then really necessary win for Team Liquid here. They needed to prove that they could continue to be a good team, and I think they proved that here, that they can be one of the best teams in the league, or they can at the very least, you know, game to game be one of the best teams in the league, especially if this bot lane steps up, and especially if this top lane stays consistent. Then moving on to our third game here of day number 2, and it's another really interesting one. Two teams with the same record, as we had Dignitas taking on TSM. And Dignitas is able to pick up the win here, and they move to 4-4. Really good stuff from them. They continue to overperform some of the expectations I had set for them. Maybe they're the team that I kind of said TSM was after week number 2, where it's like, I don't really think they have the talent to be able to keep up with teams, and I certainly don't think that by the end of the year they should be a top 6 team, but you know, they're playing better than the inconsistent teams in the league right now, and that has to be accounted for. That might be Dignitas, and they continue to look really good here. TSM continues to look, quite frankly, significantly worse with Ruby in than they did with Insanity, which basically anybody with a pulse would have told you before these games started, and so really, really interesting to see that. But let's talk about Dig first and foremost. Player of the game, pretty obviously going to go to Tomo on this Kai'Sa. Really good game from him. This is his best game of the split by far. He's been relatively good for this team ever since since he was called up. I think from a stylistic perspective, he's exactly what they needed in the bot lane, which was an AD carry that isn't afraid to go and make plays, that isn't afraid to step up and try and be a facilitator for them. Santorin and Jensen are a very passive jungle mid duo, and they're ones that want to give resources over to somebody. So having a player in Tomo who's like, yeah, give me resources, I'm going to step up and I'm going to try to initiate plays for the rest of the team, I think is very positive. Rich has obviously done a really good job of helping with that. He's also a pretty aggressive player in terms of team fighting towards the back half of the game, and that always sets your AD carry up for a significantly better position. But for Tomo, his mechanics have always been there. He just needs teammates around him that are going to put him in a position where he can play the AD carry position, and I think he did that relatively well here. But Santorin and Jensen easily had one of their best games of the split as well. Poppy and Azir combo can be very dangerous to play into. Jensen was dealing a ridiculous amount of damage and was definitely the better mid laner in this game, and Santorin easily the best game of the split for him. He was super active in the mid game. He was actually going out and trying to make plays with his teammates. This felt like Team Liquid Santorin. This felt like FlyQuest Santorin, and that's what I want to see. I don't want to see Dignitas Santorin anymore. I don't want to see the player that doesn't do anything for the first 10 minutes of the game and then just slowly loses, because that's kind of what he's done over the course of this year. I like to see the aggressiveness. He still could be a little bit more active in the early game, but as Poppy, it's not necessarily always going to be your role to initiate things like that. And so overall, Santorin looked good. Rich was fine. Diamond, I think, is still making some over-aggressive engages on the Nautilus, but for the most part was actually at least setting up plays for Tomo to be able to make throughout this game. And so Dignitas just generally looking competent in this one, and I think that's better than a lot of the other teams in the LCS, at least consistently. And then for TSM on the other side, it really does feel like a lot of the magic that they had at the beginning of the split has worn off, if you will. Ruby coming in has really not filled the shoes that Insanity had. I know he wasn't perfect in week number 2 and definitely had his hiccups, but this team played around him, I think, relatively well, and having his more eclectic champion pool, if you will, with the Graves mid, I think was definitely something that helped this team out. Ruby, I think, is just late to a lot of these plays, and I don't want to criticize him too much because really, like, mechanically speaking, he's not making major mistakes. He's not getting bodied in lane or anything like that. But what the problem is that it feels like he's not connected with the rest of the players, and that could be because he just got into the country. So again, I don't really want to overreact and say that Ruby's the only problem here. I don't believe that. I think a lot of the issues that he is currently having is at the very least explainable by saying that, you know, he hasn't necessarily had a ton of time practicing with the rest of these players, but a lot of the rest of them are just not playing all that well right now, if I'm being honest. Chime's going to get my dead of the game on the Braum. He needed to peel significantly better for Wild Turtle. It felt like both AD carries in this game were tasked with setting up the rest of their team, which is a very weird situation to be in. And Turtle just didn't have the rest of his team step up in the same way that Tomo did for his. I think Turtle actually played relatively well despite his 6-death scoreline, and Chime, I think, was a big reason why they ended up not really having any sort of pressure. If the Jinx had any sort of survivability in these fights, which is basically all you're asking for when you have a Braum, I actually do think that TSM has a chance to win these games. But Haunter continues to be bad on the top side. Boogie is just kind of there, like I always say. In the jungle, there are definitely problems for TSM, and I think a lot of them are coming out right now. This could be a bottom tier team, I should say, and I really wouldn't be all that surprised, and it really does feel like any sort of magic that this team had and any sort of confidence that this team had at the beginning of the split feels mostly gone at this point. And then for Dignitas, maybe they're the opposite. They're going to be a competitive team. They're going to be able to take out some of the lower teams in the league. Maybe they're not going to be able to compete with some of the better teams, at least talent-wise, but especially if Santorin and Jensen can get more performances like this, like Dignitas could be a team that ends up maybe surprising a lot of people and being closer to top 6 than a lot of people expected. And then moving on to our 4th game here of day number 2, and it's not quite an upset. Really, probably the most expected outcome. We had Evil Geniuses taking on Immortals, and EG is able to get the job done. They're able to pick up the win in 26 minutes. A relatively clean game from them. A couple of mistakes here and there, but it didn't really matter. They were so far ahead by the time that some of their individual micro, like mechanical mistakes ended up coming in that they really just weren't going to be able to be punished for basically any of them. So Evil Geniuses continuing their run. They moved to 7-1, and actually, they're going to be the only team moving out of day number 2 with a 7-1 record, with Cloud9 dropping that game to Team Liquid. So they're officially in first place right now in the LCS. We'll see how long that lasts because they play Cloud9 on the final day of this week, but it's certainly something that I don't think a lot of people expected, but a lot of people are really excited about, and I definitely have some thoughts on this conversation. I am definitely excited about what Evil Geniuses has done. I'm really glad that they're promoting a lot of talent that a lot of other organizations didn't exactly give a fair shake, saying like, hey, we think you're really talented and we can turn this into a really good team, and they were absolutely right. But I really don't like the narrative surrounding teams that spend a lot of money being like, I talked about this in previous weeks with FlyQuest and with all the people being like, haha, FlyQuest, you spend a lot of money and you lost. I understand that, you know, money has not been spent well in the LCS, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like players haven't been overpaid in the past and that bad contracts haven't been given out, but I don't really like shitting on the orgs that invest in the league. Like, I feel like that is a mistake. I feel like when we look at teams like Immortals and teams like TSM that have taken major budget rosters, like, I hope those rosters don't succeed, because I don't want budget rosters to succeed. I don't want rosters of talent that you're just kind of hoping and praying can figure it out to come together and be good. Like, Evil Geniuses is different because these players have all been really good at certain levels in the past, but, like, I don't want IMT to work. I don't want TSM to work in that same way. I'm not rooting against the players. I'm just rooting against the methodology of the organizations. But I want to root for organizations like FlyQuest that go out and say, we really want to win. We want to put together the best team that we possibly can, and we're not afraid to do that with the resources that we have. That's also good for the league. And so I don't really want... I know it's a little bit of an aside, but I really don't like the conversation surrounding Evil Geniuses being Evil Genius is good, FlyQuest bad because FlyQuest spent money and Evil Geniuses didn't. I'm sure EG are still paying quite a bit for this roster. It's not like it's no-name talent like Immortals and TSM ended up bringing on. It's just, you know, talent that hasn't necessarily performed as well in recent years, and I hope FlyQuest figures it out for that same reason as well. I want NA to have the best teams possible, and I want the organizations that are committed to making NA great, like, actually succeed, right? I want the organizations that invest the time and the resources into making good teams to work, and Evil Geniuses has done that, in my opinion, regardless of what you feel about management, which obviously is a completely different story. But let's talk about the players. Let's actually talk about the game. It's hard to talk about the game. That's why I went on that rant, because really this was a blowout. JoJo's gonna get player of the game. He's just so ridiculously good on Silas. Like, it's unfair when he gets to play this champion. Even last split when he was struggling quite a bit for consistency, whenever he would get the Silas, it would be unfair. He is like the odds-on major leader to win MVP in the league through the first half of the split, and these are the games why. Like, he's just able to take over. Even when he misses everything in a team fight towards the back half of this game, it doesn't matter. He's so far ahead that he's just able to one-shot people anyways. It's a lot of fun to watch JoJo from ahead. Our Mayo continues to path incredibly well in this Edge-1. Revenge looked really good on the Renekton against his former org in Immortals, and Unforgiven and Ayla are really, really good. Unforgiven just one-shot people towards the back half of the game, even though he wasn't fed, and Ayla had some fantastic engages. He's been one of the better supports in the league on Rakan, so EG looking good. And then for Immortals on the other side, they're just not very good. They're the worst team in the league at the current moment, and I don't think it's particularly close. They're the only team that I don't think looks all that competitive in basically any of their games. My dud of the game is again going to go to Kenvi. I think he's gotten almost all of them for Immortals over the course of this split so far, and that's really frustrating to see, because again, I really like Kenvi as a player, but it feels like this org has failed him. He's turned into a player that has just not been very good at the LCS level. He might need to go back down into the NACL, back down into that tier 2, kind of regain his confidence before he gets another shot, because he's definitely talented enough to be able to succeed here, but it's just been mostly negative at the LCS level. And then Balulu was also pretty bad. I know people really like him as a personality and as a player, but he was completely gapped by JoJo Pew in this game, and it wasn't great. Tactical and Treats didn't have a very good game on the Jinx and the Braum. Solo did nothing on the Ornn, gave over a ton of lead to Revenge over on the other side. Just not a great game from Immortals, but it's not particularly surprising. This is one of the best teams in the league, and it's probably the worst team in the league in Immortals, and so not really shocking to see Evil Geniuses kind of destroyed and come out on top. But as much as we should be praising a team like EG, let's not take for granted the fact that investing in the league is a good thing after all. And then moving on to our 5th and final game here of the second day, and it certainly is an intriguing one between Golden Guardians and 100 Thieves. That Golden Guardians is going to be able to pick up the win in. Really good to see them continue to at least be relatively strong towards the beginning part of this split. I think the 5-3 record after this game doesn't necessarily tell you the full story of what they've been able to do. A lot of their losses have been very weird. Obviously, one of them to Cloud9, one of them to Evil Geniuses. Neither of those are really all that bad. They're both pretty excusable with the form that both of those teams are in at the current moment, but that one earlier this week against NRG is definitely a little bit frustrating, and that was very avoidable by them. But that, honestly, the fact that it was avoidable is the reason why I still have a lot of confidence that this team is going to be fine moving forward, and this is another game that shows, yeah, they're gonna be fine moving forward. 100 Thieves is just kind of an average team in the league at this point, and Golden Guardians is certainly better than that. 6A is gonna get my player of the game here. Some really good stuff coming out from the Aphelios. He was even 1v2ing at points in this game, was just super active. It's good to see Stixxay step up. He really hasn't been a huge focal point for this team at the beginning part of the split. I think Huhi has definitely taken more of a precedent in terms of the bot lane prio and the bot lane spotlight for Golden Guardians, but Stixxay's still fine. They're a really good bot lane, one of the best in the entire league, certainly one of the most consistent in the entire league, and that's a big positive. Licorice had another really good game this time on the Rumble. He's not afraid to pull out picks like the Rumble or other aggressive picks that aren't necessarily the most meta at the current moment and do really well on them. It's good to see him do it into Someday as well, who can be rather difficult to break down, especially towards the back half of the game. And then River and Gory were definitely the better players in their individual roles as well, in my opinion. They were definitely gapping Closer and Quid. They definitely had more impact on the game, but really when you're looking at Golden Guardians and the positives that you want to take away from this game, the big positive is that they actually had relatively decent macro. Now, there were some pretty big mistakes in the mid-game in particular, which used to be a part of the game that I really liked Golden Guardians in, and their macro was something that I think was really a big positive for them in their playoff run last split, but it hasn't necessarily been the same case in Summer so far. That's something that I expect them to be able to get better at as the split goes on. Obviously, I think just figuring out how you want to play with these specific team compositions and with the way that you're playing the game at the current moment, how you want to format the way that you get into your end game, I think is going to be significantly better the more time you give them. So it's not something that I'm particularly worried about. Huhi has always been on teams that have been able to figure that out as teams have gone forward. He's just really good at that. And this team is definitely talented enough, as we've seen with a lot of these players stepping up in recent weeks, to be, you know, near the top of the standings. And I think this game just kind of confirms that for a lot of people. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, they're just not what we wanted them to be, right? They're not a top 4 team. They're not a team that's going to be able to compete for some of the more interesting spots, at least at the current moment. They obviously can get there, but it's really not working in the way that I think a lot of people had hoped it would. And the big problem right now for me feels like the synergy between the jungle and the mid, which is so big in the meta right now. I talk about it all the time on the channel, but you can really highlight when a jungler and a mid laner are not on the same page in the current meta, because it really matters, especially for the mid game. And right now, 100 Thieves just don't have that. Closer has been very disappointing, in my opinion, at the start of this split, has been super inactive in terms of the early game, and then just makes quite a few mistakes towards the back half as well. Has been really disappointing in 2023 as a whole. He was kind of better towards the back half of last year, but disappointed again in the playoffs, and that's definitely carried over to the beginning of Summer Split. Quid, after having a pretty decent, end to week number 2 and, looking a little bit more, I would say, accustomed to playing here and getting better, took a little bit of a step back in this game, was just very inactive, very late to plays, a couple of big mechanical misplays, and he was just trying to be a hero, I think a little bit too much for a team that didn't necessarily need that. They had a Xayah, who, yes, made some mistakes this game as well, but the Azir does not need to be the one that is making every single play for this team, and it definitely felt like Quid kind of took that upon himself to be that guy. He was that guy a lot on Gen G, and that was something, again, that I was concerned about. He had to make a lot of hero plays on Gen G challengers in the LCK Challengers League. That's something that he did a lot, and he's not going to have to do that for this team, and honestly, it came back to bite him in a game like this. It's going to be interesting to see if those habits are consistent, if he's going to be able to break them, or if they're going to be dragging him down for the rest of the split. But overall, I would say for 100 Thieves, they're just kind of meh, right? Like, Someday's fine in the top lane. I still like him a lot as a player, but he's not going to drag your team across the finish line. There are so many good bot lanes that Doublelift and Busio being good isn't exactly, like, going to carry you across the finish line, right? Other bot lanes are just as good, like Stixxay and Huhi. So Closer and Quid not being good, like, that's going to be a little bit of a problem. I've had this team at number 6, basically all split up until this point. They might stay there for quite a while. And then for Golden Guardians, they might even go lower, I should have said. For Golden Guardians, this team is still good. I had them at number 2 after last week. I'm not exactly sure they're going to stay there because they have shown some major macro errors, at least up until this point, but for the most part, this team has looked good, and I still have a lot of confidence that they're going to be one of the harder outs in the LCS. And then moving on to our third and final day here in the LCS in week number 3, and we got to kick it off with the matchup that I think the most people were the most excited for this week. A battle between potentially the top 2 teams in the league, as we saw Cloud9 taking on Evil Geniuses. And Cloud9 said, nah, not today. We are going to absolutely obliterate you. This is not your league. This is our league. We are still the number 1 team. I know we lost to TL, but it does not matter, EG. You can't just step up and pretend like you're going to be able to compete with us. And that, Cloud9, I think, said that very emphatically with their chest. They had more kills than minutes in the game in this one. 25-3 in 22 minutes. What a slaughter. Just a complete domination from Cloud9. They were so clearly the better team in this game. They looked super motivated to play this one. one. And honestly, I'm super here for it. I'm all in for Cloud9 looking as good as they possibly can. They're the best team in North America, and I think they reproved it in this game, even with that loss to TL. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, take your freaking pick. I mean, give it to Blabber, give it to Eminus, give it to Berserker, give it to Sven, like, even give it to Fudge on the Cassante. The dude took over the game towards the back half. Like, Cloud9 just massacred them in every lane, in every role, at every part of the game. They were everywhere. I'm going to give it to Blabber on the Kindred because I think it was the most flashy performance that anybody had in this game, and certainly Kindred's one of those picks that, you know, 2018 Blabber loved pulling out and was certainly kind of a pocket pick for him back in the day, but it hasn't necessarily been as prevalent as the champion has maybe gotten a little less popular over the years, or at least a little bit more meta-defining, a little bit less meta-defining, I should say, over the years, but Blabber can still pull it out and be an absolute menace. There is a massive difference between his Vi and his Kindred, and it definitely showed in a game like this. 11-1-8 doesn't even really tell the story of how much he gapped Armeo, but I think you could say the same thing about Eminus, who had a phenomenal game. I honestly really wanted to give this player of the game to Eminus in the mid lane, who just went absolutely berserk on the Ahri. He was everywhere on the map, gapping JoJo in lane and then just leaving to kill Unforgiven over and over and over again. If I was the Varus, I would be so tilted from this game because there was literally nothing that he could have done to save himself in a lot of these circumstances. Berserker went deathless and was still a super big impact onto Ashe, and Sven, 22 assists on the Milio, was absolutely destroying people. Fudge really took over some of the late game team fights on a Cassante champion that everybody is complaining about at the current moment. It's just a crazy collection of talent, and, you know, they really maximized it here for Cloud9. This was probably the best game that they have played all year long, and that really is saying something. And then for Evil Geniuses, 7-1 no more, 7-2 tied for first place is still a pretty good way to end week number 3, but you probably would have liked to at least be competitive in this game, and unfortunately for them, they just were not. They were not competitive really at all in this one. Dud of the game, you know, just like I said for Cloud9, player of the game could have gone to absolutely anybody. Dud of the game can go to basically anybody on the side of Evil Geniuses. They all lost. They all had a bad game. You want to give it to Armeo for losing pressure basically instantly, that's fine. You want to give it to Revenge for being legitimately useless the entire game, that's fine. JoJo Pune got completely outroamed, that's fine. But I'm going to give it to Unforgiven in the bot lane. Just, I mean, did he do anything? He was there and then he was gone. He died to Kindred, he died to Ahri, he died to Ashe, he died to everyone. He wasn't there this game, and it's very, very unfortunate. But again, it's not even entirely his fault. There's only so much you can do as an AD carry usually in positions like this, and he kind of just got run over. It's unfortunate that it ended up being that way, but for Unforgiven, hopefully he can be a little bit better, and for Evil Geniuses, hopefully the situation can go a little bit better next time that they end up running into something like this. They were looking so good, basically unstoppable up until this game, but clearly Cloud9 is just kind of on a different planet than everybody else at the current moment, and they took this game, and they took that loss to Team Liquid a little bit personally. They showed up with a vengeance, and this 22-minute win definitely proved that. And then moving on to our second game here of day number 3, and this is another top-of-the-table clash. We had Team Liquid taking on Golden Guardians, and Golden Guardians is going to be able to pick up the win here, kind of cementing themselves still in that top 3 at the very worst, maybe even still in that top 2, looking pretty good in this one. Whatever problem that they had towards the back half of that first game of the week against NRG seems to have been solved here as they're going up against a Team Liquid team that is pretty dangerous and actually had some gold in this game, and they're able to come out on top with just better play over the back half of this game. TL actually had quite a bit of a lead going into the middle game. What am I talking about? The mid game of this one here, and Golden Guardians did a good job to keep calm, to not worry about it too much, and to fight their way back into the game with some really good team fights coming in. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Stixay in the bot lane. I think a lot of people are going to give this one to River because of the scoreline. I think Broadcast ended up giving it to River, but Stixay for me was definitely the most noticeable player in this game, and I think he was the one that really drove them forward. Had a rough early game on the Aphelios, which is going to happen sometimes, especially into a Varus matchup. You're really just not able to, like, deal with him all that much in the early game. You kind of just have to bide your time and wait until the late game until you can actually start fighting. But man, that late game definitely came, and Stixay out of lane continues to be a little bit of a copy pasta meme that you can continue to post, because he was legit 1v5ing at points in this game. It's actually absurd. I think he actually did 1v2 Pioshik and Harry at some point towards the back half of this game, which was legitimately unreal. But Stixay was phenomenal, and he was, in my opinion, the biggest reason why Golden Guardians was actually able to win this game. If you've got a less good AD carry and more average AD carry, I don't think it's going to be nearly as as easy to win this. But I do want to give a lot of credit to River. I think he played really well on the Viego. There were a lot of really good engages, and the resets are obviously very difficult to deal with for the opposing comp, and I think he definitely had more pressure coming out of the jungle. He was the better jungler by a lot in this game. Licorice had a pretty good one on the Poppy. That ultimate in that final fight onto Yon that I don't think the casters ended up catching was massive for that game. It obviously meant that the Varus wasn't in the fight, but it meant Stixxay really didn't have to worry all that much about being able to kind of weave in and out of traffic. He didn't have to dodge arrows as well coming in from the Varus, and so overall, it just made the fight a lot easier. Those were the three players that I think really stepped up. Not to say that Gory and Kuki played bad at all. I just think the most noticeable were Stixxay, River, and Licorice, in my opinion. And then for Liquid on the other side, just a couple of major mistakes towards the back half of the game, mostly coming from Pioshik in the jungle. Just not a very good Vi game. Actually, very similar to what we just said about Blabber when we were talking about him in a couple of the previous games, where it's like, yeah, you're really good at these more aggressive picks like the Kindred, but the Vi has never really been your cup of tea. Now, Pioshik is definitely better at Vi, or at least he's played a lot more games on Vi than Blabber has, but still, not a very good game from him. He was diving into the backline, couldn't even kill the Aphelios towards the back half of the game. So what really was the point of the Vi? Wasn't able to create all that much pressure at the beginning. A lot of your pressure ended up coming from Harry and coming from Yon and Core laning pretty well. Harry had a really good early game, made a couple of critical mistakes, was really bad in that final team fight, and also missed some charms, but I'm not going to hold that entirely against him. Good players miss abilities every once in a while. He's not like the best player in the entire world. I'm not going to hold him to that standard. He does need to be a little bit more consistent, but I do think he had a really good early game, and he did exert the pressure of his champion relatively well. He was moving around the map, trying to create plays. He was doing everything he needed to do, and he was able to generate a gold lead because of it. And I think that is more important than the fact that he did mess up some combos towards the back half of this game, but obviously those are things that you do want to see cleaned up. Yon and Core were also really good in lane, but like I said, Yon getting Poppy ulted out of that final team fight was disastrous for Team Liquid, and it basically lost them the game on the spot. Yon just really couldn't do anything there, and so Stixxay ended up having more of an impact on the game overall. I don't want to blame them. Really, again, I hate to say it, it's Summon and Pioshik not stepping up and not being a carry focal point for the game. Pioshik having a bad game, that means Team Liquid just isn't going to win. It's how this team operates, and it's really unfortunate to say that, because I do think that they have a lot of good young talent on this team. It just feels like a lot of it is going to be determined by their imports. And then for Golden Guardians, this team is still really good. 6-3 is a more than respectable and serviceable record moving into the second half of the split, and I think that they're going to be just fine. This could still be a top 2 team in the league, and I think they're definitely going to be looking at more than just like a third place finish at this point. And then moving on to our third game here of day number 3, and it's another really interesting one between Dignitas and NRG that Dignitas is going to be able to take. They were the better team in this game, and I think that they have proven that they are the better team overall. Energy not necessarily performing up to expectations right now. This team has very much failed to come together and be, I think, what a lot of people kind of wanted them to be, me included, moving into the split. And Dignitas has definitely found a better footing than anything that they had at any point last split. So let's go ahead and talk about it, because they're actually looking pretty good right now. Player of the game for me is going to go to Diamond in the support position. Really good to see him have such a good game on the Rakan. Those engages were pretty fantastic coming out from him, and I think that there were multiple moments that if you don't have the Rakan being as aggressive and as willing to engage as he was in this game, that this game is just not won. I know a lot of the conversation is going to be around Rich in the top lane because he did pull out that Alawi, and obviously there are a lot of really fun things to say about that pick, but to me, none of those picks matter, and none of the aggressive stuff matters if Diamond doesn't have those engages. And so, really good stuff coming in from him on the Rakan. He's looked a lot worse in their losses than I think some other players will, and I think a lot of that is because he's not afraid to die on an engage to set up the rest of his team. And sometimes that can make him look a little bit bad, and especially when the team is from a losing perspective, you know, engaging in a position where the rest of the team might not be willing to follow up as much, might not be as ideal, especially when, you know, we've talked about it, Dignitas is a little bit more comprised of players that are a little bit more risk averse rather than risk happy. But I think when Diamond does get it right, when the rest of the team is ahead and when they're on the same page, he looks really, really good for this team. And I think that this was definitely the case in this game. Rich obviously is going to still get a lot of attention. His addition to Dignitas has been absolutely massive for this team. No flame to Armut, he just wasn't right for this team, I don't think. he wasn't the kind of player that I think they needed in order to separate themselves. Rich is somebody who is going to try and pick up these really crazy things and take some risks in the mid to late game and really be someone that pushes the team forward, can lead a team fight phase, and I think that that's something that Dignitas didn't really have last split, and so I really like Rich for this team. Obviously, Alawi's a super fun pick, and it definitely worked in this game, but, you know, there were some problems with it as well. Obviously, it's more squishy than people give it credit for, and, you know, the lifesteal is definitely great, the Omni Vamp is definitely great, but Rich can be taken advantage of, but that's where the rest of the team's damage definitely stepped up. Jensen was really good just in general this week. Easily the best week of the summer split for him up until this point. Santorin was way better in the jungle, controlled the pacing, had some really nice secondary follow-up engages to what Diamond was doing, and was also super important for Peel onto the Xayah, which was also a really, really big threat for the Dignitas comp here. And so everything just kind of working in their favor. Just a good game overall, quite frankly. And then for Energy, not a good game. They kind of lost as a team, and this is, again, like the third or fourth time that I've said that for Energy throughout this split up until this point. It's not like one individual player really underperforming expectations. Yes, you know, FBI and Ignar have had some bad games, and Palafox has had some bad games, and Dokla has had some bad games, and in this one, I think Contracts was probably the worst. He's going to get my dud of the game, but it really isn't like one player losing them games. It really is just Energy losing pressure around the map, and then not being able to recover and losing a team fight towards the back half of the game to make the game over. And that really is kind of the big problem with them, which is why I don't feel very confident that they're going to be able to figure this out. Now, luckily, if they're able to get on the same page, if they're able to be a little bit more clinical in the early to mid game, this team has upside. These players are mechanically talented enough to be able to hang. We've seen that in some of these laning phases. They really haven't been all that bad in terms of the early game, just individual 1v1 or 2v2. It's everything else that they just really, really struggle at. And that is concerning. That is certainly something to keep in mind, but it's not a problem that isn't fixable, which is why I think people are still looking forward to this team potentially being better. I hate the Scion jungle pick. I've talked about it a ton on this channel. We've seen it in a lot of different regions, mostly the LPL be pulled out, and I know my LPL, you know, viewers are probably tired of hearing me say this, but I've just never seen it be anything other than garbage. And Contracts was fine, I guess, in this game, but that champion just does nothing in that position. You're relying so much on the ultimate, and outside of that, you really just don't have a lot of consistent ways to be able to do anything. You don't clear particularly fast. Your ganks aren't particularly good, especially early. And Scion's not going to get nearly as tanky as he would coming out of the top lane, and so it's just kind of meh to me. Like, I get the idea behind it, but, you know, I just don't think it ended up working out. I don't think it's won in a single game that I've covered on the channel this year. I think it's like 0-8 or something like that, and I think that's pretty indicative of where the power level of that champion is, but Energy in general, I think, just needs to fix their communication, and they certainly need to fix their mid game if they ever want to be a team that, quite frankly, is competing for top 6, but maybe even a team that isn't bottom 2. And then for Dignitas, they're certainly not bottom 2 at the moment. They are competitive, they are interesting to watch, they're not perfect, they definitely still have their downsides, and if you're going to be able to shut down Rich and Diamond, I think in particular, this team doesn't have a lot of avenues to be able to win the game outside of that, but very aggressive players being able to step up, that's a pretty good avenue for being, you know, a 500 mid-table team. And then moving on to game number 4 here of day 3, and it's another one that I was intrigued to see two teams again with the same record. We had TSM taking on 100 Thieves, and 100 Thieves is able to pick up the win, as they absolutely should in a matchup like this. It's good to see 100 Thieves continue to, at the very least, be able to play League of Legends at a relatively good level, but TSM looks like they have completely imploded this week. All of the goodwill that they had generated over the first couple weeks of the split are just gone. Like, this team has not been able to keep that up, and I think, you know, we'll point out why I think a lot of that is the case, but it's really not been a good run of form for them in week number 3. But for 100 Thieves, being able to pick up this win, incredibly important to move to 4 and 5, at least keep yourself around 500, at least keep yourself in the zone of being a relatively decent team. I'm still not sold on them being a team that I would expect to ever really be able to compete for top 4 at the pace that they're currently on, but at least they're, you know, trying to stay in the conversation. Player of the game for me is going to go to Quid in the mid lane. Really excited to see him actually have a good game, and really the big difference here was the fact that he was just able to do the things that he did on Gen G Challengers, which was take all the resources, be the guy, set up in the early game, play something like the Jace, dominate, and I mean dominate, laning phase, and then transition that into being able to move on the map, and that's what he did for Gen G Challengers. He wasn't asked to play for his jungle, he wasn't asked to scale into late game, he was asked to be the guy, and that's what he was asked to do in this game, and I think it definitely helped them a lot. Quid was phenomenal. I think he broke the CS record, or at the very least was tying it very, very close with 14 CS per minute. Actually absurd this game on the Jace, but really, really, really good stuff coming in from him. Just about as good of a performance as you could possibly ask for, considering the fact that he really hadn't been all that consistent through the first couple of games this year. And then the rest of the team also stepped up. Busio was really good on the Renata this game. He's honestly going to get overlooked for how good he was, but definitely something to keep in mind. Interesting to see this team continue to go towards picks like that. Obviously, they themselves banned out the Rakan, which is certainly intriguing, but Busio is a very, very interesting player. He's been kind of up and down, but I think he was really good in this game. Doublelift was more than fine on the Varus. Closer was fine on the Maokai. Someday was fine on the Cassante. This really was Quid's game, and then the mid game of just 100 Thieves actually having macro and TSM failing to adapt to basically any play that they wanted to make. And so overall, good stuff from 100 Thieves, but outside of Quid, I don't think anybody on this team actually like dominated. They really were just kind of playing off of their mid laner, which can be fine, but certainly something to keep in mind. And then for TSM on the other side, this team's just not very good. Like, this is the true form of TSM, I believe. They have shown themselves to be a rather poor team, in fact, after all. Dud of the game is going to go to Ruby for me. In the mid lane, there's really no one else I could possibly give this to. He got steamrolled in the laning phase. I know his scoreline really isn't all that bad, but that's because he really didn't participate in almost any fight that happened throughout this entire game. As the Annie, you really need to be active on the map, especially against the Jace, who's just going to outpace you in the 1v1, but for Ruby, he was just kind of sitting in lane, not really playing with the rest of his team. And again, I do want to try to excuse him at least a little bit, because I can't imagine he's had a ton of time to actually practice with TSM, so when Boogie and Chime play like absolute madmen in this game and go in at every single opportunity and Ruby doesn't follow up, I can understand why there might be a communication issue, especially because, you know, Ruby hasn't been here forever, and so I'm going to be a little bit lenient there, but I think you have to have some level of game sense to be able to move around the map and to understand that your matchup kind of requires you to be more active, or else you're just going to lose. It was a frustrating game and a frustrating week for Ruby, and it looks like it's actually going to be his last. Maybe not his last, but he's at the very least not going to be starting week number 4. It looks like Insanity is going to be coming back into play in the mid lane, and at least with the form that's currently being shown, I do like that decision, but it's going to be interesting because I don't think Ruby ever really got a fair shake here on TSM to ever kind of learn and grow with the team, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But Boogie and Chime, like I said, were madmen, consistently taking fights that they absolutely had no right to take. Sometimes that's going to be a good thing. In this game, it was kind of a bad thing. Chime loves to roam around with his jungle and look for really aggressive plays. He was super successful at it when he had Spica on the team. Not quite as successful with Boogie, but still relatively fine. And Haunter and Wild Turtle were just kind of there. Haunter's been relatively poor. Again, another not really great game from him. And Wild Turtle, again, just kind of there. He has really good games. I'm not saying he's a bad player, but certainly isn't going to drag a bad team across the finish line, which is what TSM certainly feels like they were this week. And so I don't think this team is really going to be all that competitive moving down the stretch. I think maybe Insanity coming in is going to raise the floor of this team a little bit. I think he's a better player in the mid lane, but I certainly don't think it's going to change the outcome of TSM, you know, being just kind of a meh team. And then for 100 Thieves, hopefully they can be better than a meh team. They absolutely have the talent, and with Quid performing at this level, that's definitely going to be a possibility. The problem is you're going to need to get performances like this out of Quid, I think, more consistently. It doesn't feel like he's a very flexible player. It feels like he wants to play for that early game, get a big lead, snowball it out of control, and, you know, hopefully 100 Thieves can do that. They've been good at that in the past, but it kind of conflicts with the playstyle that they wanted to play at the beginning of this year anyway. So, gonna be interesting to see, but I'm certainly not 100% sold on 100 Thieves. And that's going to bring us to our final game of the week here as we watched Immortals taking on FlyQuest. And FlyQuest does complete the 3-0 week after starting 0-6. This is exactly what the doctor ordered, and this was easily the best game of them all. Yes, it's against the worst team that they played this week, but still really good to see FlyQuest stepping up and actually being a good team. Really excited to see them be able to get some confidence back under their belt, and honestly, a couple of these players did play incredibly well over the course of this week, even if the team as a whole still has some issues that they need to work out. But player of the game for me, it was actually kind of a toss-up. Two very, very, very real candidates in this game. Very deserving candidates in this game. But I'm going to give it to Impact in the top lane on the Renekton. Really good stuff. He was much better than Solo in the laning phase. We saw a lot of Renekton into Cassante, and honestly, we saw the Renekton win that very consistently over the course of week number 3 here, and certainly an interesting development on that in North America. I do think Renekton is very strong. We've been seeing that in other regions, but Cassante just felt like he was on a different level in terms of power, especially in a region that isn't necessarily known for taking advantage of early game leads nearly as much, but Renekton actually looked really good this week just in general. Interesting to see if teams continue to move towards that, but Impact piloted it at a very high level. We know he can play Renekton very well, and he was really good across this whole week. Just a very stable player in the top lane. I know some people are going to sit there and be like, Impact or Prince, you can only like one. which is an absurd statement to make, but we see that all over the internet right now. Spoiler alert, the broadcast ended up giving Prince Player of the Week for the entire week here for FlyQuest, and people are very mad that it wasn't Impact. Both players were really good, and Impact definitely deserved Player of the Game in this one, but Prince was also phenomenal on this Aphelios. The amount of consistent damage that he's able to do, but mostly the positioning that he pulls off, it's actually incredible. Being able to watch a lot of these fights, and just knowing that there's never an opportunity for Immortals to do anything to Prince is actually astounding for the amount that he is able to do to them. It really does feel like this week he got his confidence back, and he started playing like Prince again, and that's exactly what we wanted to see. It felt like that playoff loss really did sit in his head rather poorly, and he just wasn't able to respond and rebound as quickly as we thought he would, but hopefully this week is enough for him to be able to get his confidence back, because I really do think he was very, very good. Both him and Impact were very, very good across this week, and then everybody else was good too. Good to see Speak on the Ivern, a very interesting pick, and one that I do think, kind of works for what this FlyQuest team likes to do, which is play around their lanes, and so like to see that. Vulcan was much better on the Alistar just in general this week, and then Vikla on the Azir was good as well. Everybody pulled their job, and nobody really was a weak link at all. This was by far the most complete game that they had shown in Summer up until this point, and it's just a good sign if you're a FlyQuest fan to see them be able to come out and actually perform well. I know it's against Immortals, but at the very least you gotta start somewhere, and this was definitely a good start. And then for Immortals on the other side, this team is just bad. There really is no other way to put it. Kenvi is gonna get yet another dud of the game. That's 6 games in a row that Immortals have lost, and 6 dud of the games in a row for Kenvi, and I can only try to defend it so much. Like, he really just has not been good for this team. The Sejuani was brutal in this game, consistently out-jungled by Spica in terms of pressure, and he was just significantly too passive. Sometimes he's too aggressive, sometimes he's too passive. It just feels like no matter what he tries, it's not going to work on this team, which is very frustrating, and I know, blame jungle is definitely a popular thing, but I really do think that, Kenvi just needs to get some time to regain his confidence, because he's clearly not playing with it at the current moment. It very much reminds me of, like, FlyQuest Licorice, or, like, early Golden Guardians Licorice, where he wasn't himself. You could clearly tell he was doubting a lot of the plays that he was making, and he's talked about that a lot in interviews, and it feels like it's the same thing for Kenvi now, and so maybe just get him off this team and get him into an environment where he can start trusting himself again. Solo was really bad in the top lane as well, got completely run over by Impact, probably his worst game of the split up until this point, and it's not like bot lane was better. Treats has not really been all that good, was really bad over the course of this entire week. Interesting kind of little note there, considering how much he shit-talked this region, the last couple months or so definitely a little bit of a funny thing there, but Balulu and Tactical were fine. I mean, there's only so much they can do in situations like this. They certainly weren't the problem, and honestly, Tactical really does not feel like the problem at the current moment. It just feels like Immortals is completely and utterly doomed, which is a very frustrating thing to say, because this team does have upside and this team does have potential, but I just don't think it's going to be hit. Week 1 is definitely a fallacy, and it looks like this is probably the worst team in the LCS. And then for FlyQuest, really glad to see them at 3-6. Really glad to see them 3-0 this week, and I think they're going to be really happy about that as well. If these players can keep that up, we know they should still be a top 2-ish team in the league. I'm not saying that they're definitely going to continue to be there, but this is a step in the right direction. At the very least, it should be a step to prove that they're not a bottom 2, bottom 3 team in the league like their record would have suggested. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCS Week 3 overview and analysis. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings after 3 weeks of action in the LCS. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. In the first column to the right, you're going to see the updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. Let's go over my biggest risers and my biggest fallers in my personal power rankings. 1, 2, 3, and 4 stay the same. I feel like they all showed exactly what I expected. EG and Golden Guardians maybe can flip-flop, but C9 at 1, TL at 4, that feels pretty accurate to where these two teams are at the current moment, and then GG and EG are somewhere in 2 and 3. I feel pretty good about that. But then the rest of this is really weird. 100 Thieves and Fly are both going to jump up to 5 and 6. I hate putting 100 Thieves at 5. I really, really do. I really don't want to have them there, but right now they feel like the team that probably is the most consistent. They could absolutely move down in future weeks, though, if they continue playing the way that they are. FlyQuest is going to move up to 6. I have quite a bit of faith in this team to just be good at the very least, and I think they were good this week. And then Dignitas moves up to 7. I think a lot of people are going to put them as high as number 5 in their power rankings, and I honestly wouldn't hate that. They've honestly been better across this split than 100 Thieves or FlyQuest. I just don't trust that they will be better across the rest of this split. They clearly show that they're better than the bottom 3, who I think are kind of separate, but they're somewhere in that mold. I think top 4 and the bottom 3 are all kind of in their own categories at the current moment, and bottom 3 for me is pretty obvious. TSM's going to drop to 8. I think with Insanity coming back in, I don't want to put them in the bottom 2, although they are are dangerously close to that. Energy is going to be dropping into the bottom 2, though, going down to number 9. I just have not seen anything that I feel super confident about when it comes to this team. And then Immortals is going to stay at number 10. This is pretty obvious to me. They have not been able to win since that pretty good week number 1. And so those are my power rankings. Let me know who I'm too high on and who I'm too low on down in the comment section below. But it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. My player of the week for week number 3 is going to go to Prince, the AD carry for FlyQuest. The team went 3-0 this week, and Prince looked really good doing so, going deathless throughout the entire week, was a consistent contributor, especially towards the back half of every single one of their games. I also heavily considered Impact for this role. I think you could very much give it to either of them. They both played incredibly well, but for me, I ended up going with Prince. I thought he was just slightly more consistent throughout all of the games, even if I think Impact was also really good. But for FlyQuest to bounce back in general and go 3-0 this week, it's got to be incredibly exciting for their fans and for those players in particular. But dud of the week for me in week number 3, no surprise, is going to go to Kenvi, the jungler for Immortals. That's 2 weeks in a row now where he's been dud of the week. He was dud of the week in week 2, dud of the week in week 3. Certainly not been a good start to the summer split for Kenvi, and it's honestly just kind of continued a trend that he's started ever since basically he got into the LCS, which is not really adapting all that well. Again, how much of it's environment, how much of it's confidence, and how much of it's skill, I don't know. I don't know how to divide up that formula, but the combination of all of those things have certainly turned Kenvi into a player that is really struggling at the moment, and for me, was a pretty obvious choice for Dead of the Week here in week 3. I also considered Pioshik for this role. Pioshik had a pretty poor week for Liquid, and Liquid just underperformed in general, but Kenvi definitely underperformed him, I would say. So Dead of the Week is going to go to Kenvi, and Player of the Week is going to go to Prince, but that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comment section below, and of course, leave a like on this video. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people as well. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the LCS every single week on this channel, and all the other major regions as well. All 4 of the other major regions and the NACL every single week on this channel. If you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything happening in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.